Okay, yeah. So today I'm going to be talking about the work we do with biosolids in Douglas County, looking at how they impact soil health and yield in these semi-arid dryland cropping systems. And so I think probably many of you know that a big majority of the wheat and grain production in Washington state is unirrigated and located in dry areas. So this kind of creates a unique set of challenges for farmers in these systems. Um, in a lot of cases, to bank soil moisture and stabilize yields over time, a wheat fallow rotation is practiced, or a crop fallow rotation. And this is definitely necessary in a lot of cases, but it can have some like negative soil health impacts. Specifically, organic matter can decrease and carbon and nitrogen content in the soil. And so a really great way to kind of improve soil health in these systems and in most agricultural systems is adding organic matter to the soil. So organic matter can improve things like water holding capacity and soil structure, microbial activity, and nutrient cycling. So where biosolids come in with this is biosolids can be applied as alternatives to synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, and they contain a lot of plant essential nutrients beyond simply nitrogen, but they're also an organic matter source for the systems they're applied in. And in Washington state in particular, there's a mandate by the Department of Ecology that we should beneficially use biosolids, and they're considered a resource here. And so land application is a big part of that. And in Douglas County, there are many, many acres in production using biosolids as fertilizers. And so this work kind of is exploring agronomically relevant rates and the impacts on soil health with biosolids being applied in these systems. And so in the past, research has found that biosolids can increase nitrogen availability several years after the last application. So typically, biosolids aren't always applied like every year, like a typical fertilizer would be. They're applied every few years, maybe every 4 years. And so we get continued nutrient release with biosolids, which is really nice because there's a lot of organic forms of like nitrogen and biosolids. And then they also have been found to increase carbon. Um, and let's see. So for us, our objectives in this study that I'm involved in were to look at how soil functions that were relevant to the challenges in these semi-arid dryland cropping systems, how those soil functions were influenced by biosolids. So we know that they can be good fertilizers, we know they can increase soil carbon, but we also believe that because they're such a good organic matter source, they can improve soil function in these systems. So that was a big focus of the work that I've done in my PhD. And to kind of explore this, we looked at parameters, soil health indicators, or parameters that are kind of can give us a picture of what's going on with soil function in these systems. So things relating to water regulation and soil resilience and nutrient cycling were kind of the highlights we wanted to explore. And before I get into our results, I want to just introduce this trial. So this is a long-term trial started in 1994. At the time that it was started, it was in a wheat fallow rotation, and currently it's in a grain fallow rotation. So there's been some diversification of the crops since its start. And in this trial, we're comparing an unfertilized control, a synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, and then 3 application rates of biosolids that are kind of on the when this and at this like project's inception were like a low, medium, high range and still are of like maybe a biosolid, an agronomically relevant biosolids application, if that makes sense. So we're really trying to get at like when a farmer's applying, what do we see? Because some biosolids trials apply very high rates and maybe every once in a while, but these are agronomically relevant rates being applied every 4 years, which is typical for this area. And you can see this is a very dry region in Washington. And I want to also just give you a little highlight of the nitrogen content in the biosolids versus the synthetic fertilizer too. And so this just kind of gives you an idea of what we're looking at, since this is probably something that people are interested in as well. And I can go back to the slide if you have questions later. But to get into our results, these are the some soil physical properties we looked at to kind of get at soil stability and water regulation. We looked at the available water holding capacity here on the left side of the slide. So this is kind of how much plant available water the soil can hold. And what we found was the medium and high biosolids application rates increased available water holding capacity compared to the synthetic nitrogen fertilizer and the unfertilized control. And then with bulk density, we saw a decrease in bulk density, which is a positive change for that indicator, which is it's kind of like a measure of the amount of soil per volume. So if you think about more soil in a given volume, that's like maybe a more compacted soil. And so we saw some positive changes in bulk density with all three of the biosolids application rates.
What depth parameter was that?
Thank you. This was 0 to 15 centimeters. So all of this is 0 to 15. I should have put that in my overview slide, but yes. So all of this will be from 0 to 15 centimeters. And then
Actually, to quick piggyback on the methodology, did you mention if the biosolids were incorporated or surface applied?
they're surface applied. I did not mention that, but yes, they're surface applied, and this is a no-till system, so everything's just kind of on the surface.
Thank you.
Yes, good questions. So yeah, getting into some of the organic matter and nutrient cycling parameters we looked at from left to right, the NAG enzyme is a enzyme that targets nitrogen containing compounds. So that can kind of help us understand microbial processing of organic matter and specifically nitrogen containing compounds in organic matter. So we saw an increase at the highest biosolids application rate with that parameter. Similarly, mineralizable carbon, we also saw an increase, and mineralizable carbon is the CO2 respired by the microbial community as it processes carbon-containing compounds. And then lastly, potentially mineralizable nitrogen is a measure of the organic nitrogen that can be processed by microbes and made available to plants. So with all three of these parameters that we measured, we saw an increase at the highest biosolids application rate compared to the synthetic and unfertilized controls, and in some cases, the lower biosolids application rate. This is getting into some of the potential like trade-offs that come with applying biosolids. You can see decreases in pH similar to synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, and this is something we saw at our site. We haven't seen any like yield impacts on this as a result of the decrease in pH, which is nice. So that's kind of something that we just keep our eye on, and it's something to make note of, but it hasn't impacted yield at the site. Another potential trade-off is an increase in phosphorus that can happen with biosolids because they're applied based on the nitrogen content and the needs of like nitrogen needs of plants. There's more phosphorus in that ratio, basically. So over time, there's more phosphorus than the plants can use, and we get more phosphorus in the soil, but this is an ideal kind of situation to have maybe this problem because we don't have the runoff potential like you would in maybe Western Washington. It's a very dry area and there's not a lot of nearby water bodies, but this is something to also keep an eye on, and it's something that like the phosphorus risk index is something that's been calculated for this site and should be continued to be calculated going forward. But for now, we haven't had any big problems, and the phosphorus risk index has remained at a level, like an acceptable level and all that. So to kind of close out the soil health portion, we saw key parameters or key soil health functions for semi-arid dryland cropping systems improve with biosolids applications from this work that we did. And I've highlighted there. I don't need to get into that again because we just went over it. But so we saw not changes, positive changes in everything, but in a lot of what we measured, which was nice to see. And then we saw some potential trade-offs with the increased phosphorus and decreased pH. But overall, it looks like biosolids are improving these key soil health functions for these particular systems, addressing those challenge areas I mentioned earlier. And then to get into yield, this is kind of a graph of all of the yields over the last 30-ish years, and 17 cropping years. It looks like starting in 1996. So in 12 out of those 17 years, we saw a significant increase in the biosolids plots compared to synthetic fertilizers. So that's also really good to see. And you can also see, which is also like an interesting and result of all this, is that in the starting in 2018, the farmer's been cropping almost every year, whereas previously was a lot of fallow periods maybe. So he's felt comfortable cropping more often. And that kind of leads us into another trial that I'm involved in, that's very close to this long-term trial. It was started in 2020. And in this trial, we're looking at how biosolids can help farmers integrate more soil health practices in these systems, and specifically crop regrowth, cash crop regrowth, and grazing of that. So kind of like a cover crop grazing in this system. And looking at potential synergies in the biosolids and cover cropped and grazed plots to see if this biosolids are a way to kind of integrate more cover and over fallow periods, and add like a revenue source for farmers through the grazing. So stay tuned for more on that in future. And yeah, with that, thank you for having me, and I'm happy to take any questions.